HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Reconsidering Race, Social Science Perspectives on Racial Categories in the Age of Genomics. Edited by Kazuko Suzuki and Diego A. von Vacano. Preface by Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Read by Mirron Willis. Preface. Race is socially constructed, but mutations are real. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. When we thus come to inquire into the essential difference of race, we find it hard to come at once to any definite conclusion. Many criteria of race differences have in the past been proposed as color, hair, cranial measurements, and language, and manifestly, in each of these respects, human beings differ widely. They vary in color, for instance, from the marble-like pallor of the Scandinavian to the rich dark brown of the Zulu, passing by the creamy Slav, the yellow Chinese, the light brown Sicilian, and the brown Egyptian. Men vary, too, in the texture of hair, from the obstinately straight hair of the Chinese to the obstinately tufted and frizzled hair of the Bushman. In measurement of heads, again, men vary, from the broad-headed Tatar to the medium-headed European, to the narrow-headed Hottentot, or again, in language, from the highly inflected Roman tongue to the monosyllabic Chinese. All these physical characteristics are patent enough, and if they agreed with each other it would be very easy to classify mankind. Unfortunately for scientists, however, these criteria of race are most exasperatingly intermingled. Color does not agree with texture of hair, for many of the dark races have straight hair, nor does color agree with the breadth of the head, for the yellow Tatar has a broader head than the German. Nor again has the science of language as yet succeeded in clearing up the relative authority of these various and contradictory criteria. The final word of science so far is that we have at least two, perhaps three, great families of human beings: the whites and Negroes, possibly the yellow race. That other races have arisen from the intermingling of the blood of these two. This broad division of the world's races, which men like Huxley and Ratzel have introduced as more nearly true than the old five-race scheme of Blumenbach, is nothing more than an acknowledgment that, so far as purely physical characteristics are concerned, the differences between men do not explain all the differences of their history. It declares, as Darwin himself said, that great as is the physical unlikeness of the various races of men, their likenesses are greater, and upon this rests the whole scientific doctrine of human brotherhood. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Conversation of Races, 1897. Perhaps the most subtle ideological achievement of Frederick Douglass's rhetorical strategy in his Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 1845, was his extraordinary claim that race and the institutions and apparatuses designed to implement and institutionalize racism were social constructions. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave became a man. It's as simple and as complex as that. Douglass, barely 27 years old and unschooled, so boldly and directly tells us, near the middle of a century that could be deemed the age of essentialisms, especially when it came to race, which was everything, as one writer, Nancy Steppen, put it. Coming of age in the wake of World War II, and the Nazis' use of racial science to justify their theories of Aryan biological superiority, the obliteration of the Jews, and the subjugation of the world's peoples of color, our generation of scholars takes it for granted that race is a social construction. In fact, race is a social construction has long been a mantra for both post-war social scientists and humanists, and that claim, within my own primary field of literary and cultural studies, only grew in intensity with the onset of post-structuralism and the decentering of the canon in the 1980s and 1990s. If we could all, despite our mythological differences across our various disciplines, take one thing for granted, it was this: race is a social construction. And from that, I remember taking great comfort and reassurance that our generation of scholars, at long last, would deconstruct socio-economic differentials that, though created by economic forces, implemented by political design, and institutionalized through social practices, had long been masqueraded as fixed, natural, divinely ordained, inevitable, unchangeable, irreversible, or biological. Nor was this merely an abstract argument with no relevance or application outside of the academy, as Douglas most certainly knew. Nothing was more important to the quest to end de jure segregation in the United States than to be able to show that differences between the races, especially those of intelligence or IQ, were not fixed by God or nature, but the products of actual social conditions and unequal access to opportunity. Even as late as 1969, more than a year after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the first paper that I wrote in biology class, in a section directed by Donna Haraway, used studies of identical twins separated at birth to take on William Shockley's assertions that IQ differences were actually measurements of inherent differences in intelligence that were racialized. Even a sophomore at Yale could see where this was going. Why waste precious resources on Head Start programs if nature itself had affixed differences in intelligence to the world's various races? Whereas differences between individuals might be minimal, in rare cases overall, put in the simplest terms, black people were not as intelligent as white people. And they would never be. I still believe that the last vestige of anti-black racism is this belief. I still believe that this belief is very much with us, operating on all sorts of levels, both consciously and unconsciously. This will be the most difficult of all battles against anti-black racism to win. I first became concerned when a friend casually remarked that just because something was socially constructed, that didn't mean it wasn't real. Like pasta, for instance. Pasta, of course, is socially constructed, and it is delicious and nourishing, if properly prepared, etc. I enjoyed using this caveat to poke holes in my students' assuredness that race was a thing of the past, like muskets and slave ships, and then my children were born. My children, my 2 daughters, were half white, born of a white mother with no obvious recent African ancestors, and me, an African-American whose only white ancestor that we knew of was the father of Jane Gates' children. Jane Gates was my great-great-grandmother, born in 1819. When my daughters were born, 2 things happened that made me wonder about this thing we had called race. First of all, I found myself proudly making certain that their birth certificates said that they were black. And second, I found myself absolutely determined that they both have neonatal screenings for sickle cell disease because they were black. But if race is socially constructed, why did newly born Maggie and Liza Gates have to have a test for a trait that was biologically passed down? If race is socially constructed, what role did biology have in the construction of difference? Was it too socially constructed? Put another way, where did race stop and biology start? Or rather, where did biology stop and social constructs such as race begin? Perhaps, as my colleague Evelyn Hammonds put it, the issue is to understand how biological science shapes how we, the broad public and scholars, understand race, and how social ideas about race shape biological concepts of human difference. I actually thought of this just a few months ago when I heard a colleague say, astonishingly, that no self-respecting humanist could talk responsibly about the biological legacy of slavery because, after all, biology itself is a social construction. I knew that we were in trouble, that somehow we had thrown the biological baby out with the socially constructed bathwater. It would be a few decades before I became fascinated with genetics and the relation between shared mutations and human evolution and migration. And now, after some dozen or so years that I have been producing a television series on genealogy and genetics, I understand, thanks to a lot of tutoring from an astonishingly brilliant group of geneticists, a bit more about how genetic mutations arise and are shared, and about how these mutations are used to define haplotypes and haplogroups, and what all of that has to do with the dispersal of the human community out of Africa and the subsequent confusion of mutations and haplogroups with the races of man. But the quest to understand these matters actually began when my daughters got their sickle cell test results. This expertly edited volume is part of a growing but still recent attempt by social scientists and humanists to reclaim what we might think of as the discourse of race from, well, racists and racialists. As Douglas knew so precociously when it came to Africans in the New World, science and theology marched arm in arm in a devastatingly effective campaign to demonstrate the alleged inferiority of black people in a much broader intellectual, legal, political, and social project, intent upon dehumanizing them, primarily in order to rationalize their exploitation as free labor. The innate characteristics of the African had to be shown to be both fixed and natural. The tentacles of that long racist scientific project extend from roots in the musings of Hume and Kant about national character in the mid-18th century through the entire academic establishment's determination to paint the history of human progress on a scaffolding of scientific racism over the course of a very long 19th century. From there, it passed to the apologists for Jim Crow here in the United States in the dawning 20th century, and reached a zenith of lunacy with the Nazis' summoning of every daft and pernicious thing they could to justify an economic order that would ensconce their tiny class on top of a world order for the next millennium. That is the sad history of the science of race in the West over the past 250 years, and its tangled web still ensnares us today, which is part of the reason this book is so very important. The encouraging news, shared in this impressive volume, is that recent generations of scholars have largely succeeded in persuading the reading public that despite stereotypes that continue to circulate in popular culture, race is a social construction and should always be approached with a healthy dose of skepticism. The troubling news, however, is that over the same period, the humanities and the social sciences have drifted further and further away from the applied and natural sciences, especially the biological sciences, and more especially genetics. This drift has been both theoretical and methodological, and is felt more practically in the ongoing competition for relevance and resources on the college campus. The gap between the laboratory and the library carrel, between the science center and the arts and humanities buildings, is both physical and, as it were, metaphysical. It is intellectual as well as social and cultural. This siloing effect on department can be stark at times, and meaningful discourse and colloquy between the professors and practitioners of C.P. Snow's two cultures spare and far between, with no interpreter or translator, no points of mediation in sight. Meanwhile, the disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, have never in my lifetime held more sway in the public mind, at least since the Russians put Sputnik into orbit in 1957, and our teachers, I was in the second grade, implored us to learn science because the country's future as a free nation depended upon it. Today, debates about climate change, the origins of human life, even the inner workings of the human brain, enjoy a currency in popular media undreamed of by scientists even a generation ago, while policymakers concerned about the future of American competitiveness fund and stress the importance of STEM education above all as the sine qua non of an enlightened, productive, world-class working citizenry. The disconnect between the sciences and the arts, humanities, and social sciences is more than unfortunate. It is unproductive. An alarming decline in the number of college students pursuing degrees in the arts and the humanities is only one symptom of the malaise, even if it is a most alarming one. Humanists, artists, and social scientists can no longer afford to keep their distance from our peers in the natural and applied sciences. At the same time, our friends in the sciences must reach out to the social scientists and the humanists for the unique perspectives they bring on indeterminacy and uncertainty, for example, and meaning, behavior, and values, faith, and culture. This pertains not only to questions of race, the subject of this book, but also to every serious problem attendant upon being a human being, especially the future of our species on this tiny planet. When social scientists and humanists fail to engage the discourses of the sciences, both scientists and the general public are left without the broader context of meaning that we all need in order to understand the stakes of urgent medical questions, for example, or of revelations about the human genome and what these might portend for our personal and shared futures. Now, more than ever, we need to break free from the boundaries that divide us and search together for new languages that will simultaneously help society overcome the outdated paradigms of the past while embracing the wonder and remaining mysteries of discoveries occurring all around us. Discoveries, I might add, that have the potential to unlock the most elusive aspects of human identity: who we are, how our minds and bodies work, the hold that history has on us, and the role that the interplay of genetics and environment plays in shaping disease and behavior. Thankfully, this collection of essays, based on talks that came out of the Reconsidering Race workshop at Texas A&M University in May 2013, represents the promise of meaningful colloquy across the disciplines, bringing together some of our most gifted scholars to think about new ways to place science and the humanities in conversation, and to expand and complicate our understanding of race on both a historical and a global scale. After all, anyone who travels out of the country knows full well that there are myriad ways of grasping and explaining human differences, not least among groups, and that blackness, to take just one example, is a confounding subject of unending debate, bound to draw a range of responses depending on whether one is standing in South Carolina or South Dakota, Cuba, Haiti or Jamaica, Ethiopia or Eritrea, China or Vietnam, India or Pakistan, or Brazil or Peru. Who can calculate the enormous toll the essentialization of race has taken? But we must not confuse this pernicious history with the new science of genetics and its implications for understanding recent and distant ancestry and the migration of the human community out of Africa some 50,000 years ago. Whenever I walk my guests up the branches of their ancestral tree in the PBS series Finding Your Roots, I start with their birth record and follow the paper trail. When the paper trail runs out, we share with them some of the secrets of their DNA, the so-called swab test, so that we enter the scientific realm together, having already established a historical context in the social sciences and humanities for how they connect to previous generations in their families. This often is the most powerful phase of the investigation, especially for my African American guests, who so often must confront a wall of silence whenever we bump up against the deliberate silences, consciously created gaps in the archival records, imposed by the institution of slavery. Now, genetic testing allows them to learn far more about their recent African ancestral past than any generation of enslaved African Americans, since the demise of the last generation born in Africa, could possibly have known. It thus enables them to discover something of what enslavement wiped away, not with what we think of as the chimera of Alex Haley's certainty, but to learn where their ancestors over the past few hundred centuries might have originated in Africa, regionally, from northern Africa to eastern and western Nigeria and Benin, Cameroon and Congo, Mali and Senegal, Ivory Coast and Ghana, Benin and Togo. Crucially, instead of presenting these scientific findings as race-based, we emphasize what this science tells us about the distant and the recent geographic origins of our ancestors. Complexity is king, and complexity is also the hallmark of good social science and humanistic thinking. It is essential, vital even, to give people tools to make sense of what new scientific fields have to offer, such as the curious fact, for example, that the average African American's admixture is almost a quarter European, and contrary to many family histories, less than 1% Native American, two facts that often astonish our guests. This is where history comes in, and literature, and philosophy, and statistics, and population genetics, and human migration. The social sciences and humanities are, and always will be, the gateway to exploring the deepest mysteries of life, and they have a powerful role to play in the ever more interdisciplinary landscape unfolding before us, from public health to brain science to physics and space exploration. They help us to cope with the manifold contradictions of existence, grasp our way through the darkness, and, to paraphrase F. Scott Fitzgerald, hold competing thoughts or opposed ideas about ourselves and the world in our minds as we journey through this life. Race is socially constructed. Mutations are constructed biologically. I have witnessed at close hand and experienced myself the productive, even delightful role that the marriage of science and history can play in shedding light on a person's sense of his or her own identity. This is just one example of how we can begin to bridge the gap between the sciences and the humanities. This collection of essays is another. I am profoundly grateful to the editors of this volume, Professors Kazuko Suzuki and Diego A. von Vacano, for compiling this illuminating volume so that the talks presented at their historic conference about race in 2013 will now be available for a broader audience. We have much work to do to begin to heal old wounds and overcome past suspicions about the nature and function of race. While we can never wipe clean the slate of prejudice and ignorance, we must also work with our peers in the sciences to build the most solid foundation for new forms of subtle and sophisticated inquiry. If we do not embrace opportunities for interdisciplinary explorations of complex social and scientific questions, such as the vexing matter of what constitutes race, our disciplines and society as a whole will be all the poorer for our inaction. A good place to start is with this compelling collection of essays. A critical analysis of racial categories in the Age of Genomics. An introduction. Kazuko Suzuki and Diego A. von Vacano. The Destabilization of the Social Construction of Race. For at least the past 45 years, the social sciences have moved toward a widely accepted notion of the social construction of race. However, since the advent of the new millennium, there has been a fundamental challenge to the idea that race is merely a human construct, artificially developed by social and political forces. The genomics revolution, consolidated with the completion of the Human Genome Project in 2000, posed a serious question to those who had accepted the synthetic or non-natural foundations of the idea and the phenomenon of race. While many had expected the new findings to underscore the basic genetic similarity of all humans, and therefore the lack of a real basis for races, some argued that in fact the new genomics data affirmed either the existence of biologically distinctive human subgroups or the need to use the new findings to address apparent health disparities along racial lines. Race, rather than heading toward disappearance, made a stunning return. 16 years after the initial impact of genomics research on ideas of race, the social sciences have not fully come to terms with it. This volume, which is the product of intellectual exchanges generated by a conference held at Texas A&M University in 2013, aims to push toward more direct engagement by social scientists with developments in genomics investigations. The core of this volume is the interface between social scientific understandings of race and the recent research in genomics, genetics, medicine, and health policy that followed the completion of the Human Genome Project. Its aim is to examine this interface from a variety of interdisciplinary perspectives, all while seeking to move beyond the U.S.-centric conceptions of racial categories that have been dominant in the social sciences. It is important to look outside U.S. experiences and research to learn from cases and analyses rooted in views from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. While much of the cutting-edge research on race does come from the United States, we ought not to allow a U.S.-based definition of race to be hegemonic if we want to have a global and holistic account of the phenomenon. One of the most omnipresent yet elusive phenomena of social life is race. While we generally know it when we see it, we still do not quite know what it is. This is even after many efforts at trying to understand how it emerged and what its fundamental meanings are. Much of the literature on race has argued that it is a Western concept that arises with the emergence of modern imperialism, whether in the 16th century, the Age of Discovery, or the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. Moreover, while the social construction approach regarding race has become consolidated in the past 30 years in the social sciences, two important factors ask us to reconsider its utility. One is the fact that much scholarship on race widely accepted in mainstream academia has been rooted in the study of modern U.S. history. This leaves out many perspectives on the meanings and emergence of race from a variety of cultures, time periods, and geographic areas. The other issue to think about is the wide use of racial and ethnic categories in the contemporary medical and health sciences, despite the fact that racial and ethnic classifications differ across cultures and regions, even in supposedly objective medical and scientific fields. This tells us that there are still competing accounts of race that are not necessarily reconcilable with each other, especially for scholars who use the term race in the applied sciences and medicine. We believe that reducing the phenomenon of race to either biological essentialism, which asserts biological and immutable differences among races, or social constructionism, which denies a biological basis to race, is fruitless in the age of genomics. We strongly reject biological essentialism, as do most scholars from all disciplines. At the same time, we reject the idea of a pure social constructionist view, because it is only through our material bodies that we encounter our social world. Rather, we argue for the importance of interactions between our bodies and the environment. All our biological functions evolve in the context of interactions that scientists describe as gene-environment interactions, and it is as sociocultural beings that we give meaning to our bodies, whether they are racialized or gendered. Thus, it is important for us to 1. Critically re-examine the ideological hegemony of Western racial paradigms in academia and try to engage non-Western perspectives on race, and 2. Open up more fruitful dialogues between social scientists and natural scientists with mutual respect in order to see if there are common meanings of race that can be ascertained in the age of genomics. Moving beyond persisting paradigms. Although some scholars have argued that we should discard the idea of race altogether due to its untenable biological foundations, the fact remains that it is a widely used concept in social reality. At the same time, the traditional European and U.S.-based perspectives have limitations. The European model, historically, has tended to think of races hierarchically, with whites at the top of the pyramid. The U.S. model, while a vast step forward, faces the limitation that it has tended to think of race in binary white and non-white terms, for they often do not capture the array of racial phenomena in many parts of the world. Thus, we must move toward a reconceptualization of race that takes into account non-Western perspectives and more global views on how race is seen in various parts of the world and in different intellectual traditions. These ought to include the East Asian, such as Japanese and Chinese, South Asian, such as Indian, Latin American, pre-Columbian and post-colonial, Middle Eastern, and African perspectives. Not only must we examine ideas from modern times, but we must also ask whether the Western and non-Western traditions had antecedents of race in their pre-modern histories. The more punctual challenge is that the idea that race is a socio-political construct, as an engineered ideological structure of oppression that is not rooted in any scientific or biological basis, must address the fact that some of the modern sciences do employ racial/ethnic categories to analyze, diagnose, and treat particular conditions, such as organ transplants for mixed-race children, heart disease, cancer, osteoporosis, skin disorders, obesity, and gastrointestinal diseases. For people who suffer from particular health problems, when racial/ethnic categories are applied as a proxy for biological or genetic differences among human beings in medicine, race is no longer an illusory social fabrication. Rather, they have to confront it as a matter of life or death. If this is the case, social science must address this reality and seek to readdress it if there is to be a way to find a common ground for understanding race across various fields. The Human Genome Project has generated this radical need to rethink the meanings of race, in large part because scientists have used it to link genetics to diseases. More than 1,800 disease genes have been discovered through the project. Geneticists can find genes thought to cause an inherited disease in a few days, not years, as was the case before. More than 2,000 genetic tests.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?